All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Hammons. I'm the principal consultant at Secutor Consulting. My specialty is vulnerability management. I worked as a post-sales technical account manager at Qualys for 6 years. And my role there was, as a post-sales technical account manager, was a mix between account reps, sales engineering, and professional services. So not just account management, I was on the technical side as well. While I was there, I helped, and since, I've helped over 50 large enterprise organizations build and expand their vulnerability management programs. And in the interest of time, I'd like to save all the questions for the end. I've extra reserved some time at the end. I know there's some things in here that you guys are going to want to ask about, so take some notes and we'll get to those at the end. So when Vince Lombardi became coach of the Green Bay Packers, he was asked what he was going to change. Lombardi is reported to have said, "We will use the same players, the same plays, and the same training system, but we will concentrate on becoming brilliant on the basics." Today we're going to talk about one of the basics of information security, vulnerability management. So according to Verizon, in the Data Breach Investigations Report of 2012, 97% of breaches could have been avoided through simple or intermediate controls. And the ESG, also in 2012, said that only 40%, and this is referring to the security professionals that responded to their survey, say that their organizations test the effectiveness of their security controls constantly rather than on an as-needed basis. So as security folks, we like to concentrate or focus on the new and exciting things like DLP, APT, BYOD. Of course, those things are important too, but the fact is that most breaches occur without complicated hacking. The attackers are just walking in through wide open doors. So my takeaway from these two statements is that if we could consistently, and that's the key word, consistently apply those simple or intermediate controls, then we'd become exponentially more secure. Oh, thank you. So I've seen a lot of vulnerability management programs that were in a very sorry state. In fact, most of the people that I've helped out have told me that their organization and security stance is the worst. But if everyone is the worst, well, then each one isn't really as bad as they thought they were. Well, at least not in comparison to the others. That doesn't mean they're secure, though. It's just that they're relying on someone else being an easier target. So vulnerability management is usually put on a back burner with little to no resources or budget. Scanning is done on just a small section of the network or even just the perimeter. Whatever is required by whatever regulation that organization falls under. The vulnerabilities that they do discover are then only remediated when those regulations require it. So there's always pushback from the patching folks. Nitpicking at false positives, using each one as an excuse to claim that none of the scan data is trustworthy. I'm sure you guys have heard from them, this is all just a waste of our time, or we've got more important things to do. Thank you. And of course, every time there's a crash on the network, vulnerability management is the first thing that everybody points their fingers at. And sometimes rightfully so. So the vulnerabilities just get ignored. So here are the most common reasons for having a vulnerability management program. So as I mentioned, vulnerability management is usually driven by regulations. And of course, what's a vulnerability management program without remediation, patching? And the last one The last one has become a bit of a joke in the last few years, keeping your name off the front page. There's hardly any room anymore on the front page. Right? And Ashley Madison, Mount Gox, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Kaspersky, Anthem, Experian just this week. Yeah. So, yeah, of course. But you can get a lot more out of vulnerability management. So once you've scanned your network, you'll have data of one form over another from everything that's on your network. And adding authentication to your scan, allowing the scanner to log on to each of the boxes and collect more data, will get you even more data, will provide even more information that is useful in other ways. So of course, scanning your perimeter is very valuable, even if there aren't any vulnerabilities. Keep in mind, though, that this view is from only one point in the internet. You're scanning from one IP address, and what your perimeter is could change based on that IP address changing. So here's a great way to be proactive with vulnerability management. Have a policy for scanning hosts before they're brought online. This could help you catch problems with the base image. So most vulnerability analysis tools, well, let's make a distinction here. Vulnerability analysis is the tool that does the scanning. Vulnerability management is the processes and the around the vulnerability analysis data, what you do with it. So most vulnerability analysis tools have some sort of an API which can be used to automate repetitive and mundane tasks. So for example, no one should be running your regular reports manually. You should have a script that's doing that. They should be run automatically on their own and distributed to the stakeholders in whichever format that they need it, in whichever subset of the data that they need. And integrations, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I have a whole slide just on integrations. So if you have a consistent and well thought out process, then you should be able to provide each stakeholder with just the data that they need and in their preferred format, whether that's PDF or CSV or XML, whatever it is they need that make their job easy, you should be able to provide it that automatically. Of course, every organization is different, but here's some general strategies. One, balance between scanning too infrequently to be irrelevant and scanning aggressively and overloading hosts and network devices. Start at the slow end and work your way up until you can fit in the scan window. Start with a small section of the network and expand as the confidence in your tools and processes grows. Use authenticated scanning. So you'll find a lot more vulnerabilities. There'll be a lot more data, which can cause some pushback because there's now more to do. But you can always filter and prioritize that information. I think it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Plus, there's a lot of interesting ancillary data that authenticated scans can discover. And then fourth, prioritize. It takes time and money to remediate, so find a logical and easily implemented method to find the worst vulnerabilities and go after that low-hanging fruit. Challenges. Yes, so expect things to crash. It's not what you want to hear. That's not what the change management, network operations, system owners want to hear, but that's the reality. Some vulnerability analysis tools are better at it than others. Some are more soft on the network than others, but prepare everybody in advance. Set the expectation that some things are going to crash. And use that to get sign-off on the scan schedules so that each person knows exactly when the scan is going to hit their devices. And make the schedules transparent. Maybe even post on an internal portal and make it searchable so that the stakeholders can look there. As you discover what's causing crashes, you may need to blacklist certain IP addresses or ports, or maybe even change the scan schedule. But keep track of those exceptions so that you can look it up later why that's there. Network devices, expect them to become saturated. There'll be firewalls in places that no one knows about. With older devices, it'll be easy to fill the state table, especially if you happen to be scanning from a trusted segment to an untrusted segment. And to help ease people's minds, you could possibly use that vulnerability analysis scanner as API to create a stop button for the network operations. All right. So I have a short little story. One of my former customers a long time ago was starting up their vulnerability analysis program, and it happened to be an airline. And they had gotten the green light from network operations, so you can scan this new area over here. Great, all right, let's start the scan. Well, there happened to be a firewall there that the network operations literally did not know was there. It had been put up 10-something years before, and nobody knew it was there anymore. It wasn't on the asset list. Nobody knew it was there, but it was doing its job. And it happened to be that this area that they were scanning was at the airport, and they were scanning it from their data center. Well, this firewall was between the data center and the airport. It filled the state table and caused an airplane not to take off on time, because at the check-in, where you put your ticket in and it goes bing and has the green light, it couldn't communicate back with the data center to say that that ticket was valid, so the airplane didn't take off. Now, fortunately, nobody lost their job, but just as a real-world example of what to keep in mind, that something like that could happen. So get people sign off on those scan schedules and what's going to be hit and when. So patching software, it looks for the absence of patches, but the vulnerability scanning looks for the presence of vulnerabilities. Now, on the surface, that sounds like the same thing, but it isn't. They can actually say opposite things and still both be accurate. For example, a patch might not be installed correctly, or the machine that may need a reboot for the patch to become active. Or a DLL may be still existing on a computer after the software that's around it has been upgraded, but it left the old DLL there. So the vulnerability scanner will see the old DLL and say it's vulnerable. But the patch will say, well, we can't install that. Patching system will say we can't install that patch because we've got a newer version of that software. So that can happen. Where are we at? Prioritization. Prioritize network accessible vulnerabilities first. I use the CVSS score and host value and how accessible the vulnerability is. I said accessible, how accessible the vulnerability is. The first two are easy. The vulnerability scanner will provide that. How bad is the vulnerability? How important is the host? I'll cover how to calculate accessibility as a metric in a couple slides. DHCP will keep things interesting. Tracking down hosts that have moved or are offline adds time to the process. DHCP can make trending metrics for individual hosts useless unless your VA tool can track that for you, like, for example, using the NetBIOS name or DNS name, or maybe even putting a unique flag on each host for you. DHCP can also play havoc with the scan database. I recommend purging any hosts that have not been seen in 2 to 3 times your scan schedule. So if you scan once a month, then check the database once a month for anything that has not been seen in 2 to 3 months. Because it hasn't been seen that long with a monthly scan schedule, then it probably doesn't exist anymore. So database hygiene to keep everything relevant. And empower the asset owners and the patching team. Encourage them to run their own scans ad hoc so that they can test the remediation efforts. Another challenge is who owns the machine or service. Authenticated scans can help. They collect things like the last user login and installed programs and local users. Integration with the asset management system can help too if you happen to have one. And it's actually something that I highly recommend, at least in larger environments. And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about, is really large environments. It can be a real challenge figuring out just who do I even talk to make sure that this machine gets its patch? Who owns it? And there may be multiple owners depending on which services are on it. There may be 5 different people, and each one has a different service, and you've got to talk to them and make it relevant to them. So in this last part, scanning, scanner placement, what's in and out of scope, this is really important. Scan behind firewalls, not through them. Scanning through the firewall is really only testing how effective the firewall is, not how vulnerable are the things behind it. So a vulnerability scan relies on malformed packets and to discover vulnerabilities, just like a hacker would. A firewall will correct or block malformed packets even from whitelisted sources. And if you don't have any other option, a firewall that's in transparent or wire mode is better than whitelisting. As I mentioned, filling state tables on firewalls is a danger, especially when scanning from trusted to untrusted. Discovery scans are worse than vulnerability scans. Discovery scan is a quick push through your network, looking at each individual host or each individual IP address, only looking at a few ports to see what's there. Just doing a discovery. A vulnerability scan will look at all the ports, will spend a lot of time on each port, and do a deep analysis and find those vulnerabilities. Now, I would have expected that the vulnerability scan would cause the state table to fill more so than the discovery scan would. But the discovery scan, the vulnerability scan will spend a lot of time on those ports that it finds open. Even though it's looking at many more ports, it'll cycle through the unused ports really quickly. The ports that are on and accessible, it'll spend a lot of time on those, where the discovery scan will hit just a few ports per IP address, but it'll only spend a fraction of a second on each port. We'll get that information in the state table and then move on. And the state table keeps that information for another 20, 30 minutes. So, and in fact, that's what happened to the airline. It wasn't a vulnerability scan. It was just the discovery that knocked out that firewall. So instead of scanning through a firewall, if you want to test the stuff that's on the other side of it, scan behind it, and then use vector analysis to see what could have gotten through. I'll talk about vector analysis a little bit later. Take a good look at the IP addresses that you want to scan. What's in and out of scope. Make sure that they really are in your network and that the network will allow the traffic from your scanner. And double check that you don't scan areas that you're not allowed to. And NAT can make that challenging if you don't have a really deep understanding of your network. So working together with network operations will be important, or network architecture. And if you're going to scan a partner network, make sure you have permission in writing. And one more thing, if you do have to start excluding ports from your scan, maintain a list of the exclusions and the reasons why. I think I already mentioned that. So where do we start? Well, start with asking lots of questions. This is just a sampling of some of the questions I use. I have a more complete list that I can share. I have some business cards. You guys can send me an email and I can share that with you. Or I have a more complete list in the February 2014 ISSA journal. I have an article on basically just this same topic where I have a lot more questions listed. So moving on. So what are we going to do with all these vulnerabilities? Well, patching or upgrading is the standard answer, but that's not always possible. The most commonly used option from this list is to ignore the problem, which is fine when necessary. It's not always possible to install a patch, or there's not always a workaround, but you need to keep track of those so that you can revisit them in another month or two where things might have changed. So there's going to be a mountain of data, and prioritization is going to become your biggest challenge. In general, I recommend that you prioritize network exploitable vulnerabilities first. As I already mentioned, use the CVSS score and the host value. But what's more important? What's a higher priority? A workstation with a high CVSS score, 10 is the maximum, or a server in the DMZ with a 2 or a 3? What would be more important to fix? Not necessarily. I'd say that you don't have enough information to answer that. What if that workstation has a port open and is directly exposed to the internet? Well, yeah, so just from the host value and the vulnerability score, how bad the vulnerability is, you don't know. So you have to add accessibility. So accessibility is a third metric. CVSS score, host value, and accessibility for prioritizing network exposed vulnerabilities, or network exploitable vulnerabilities. After those, the next highest priority are local vulnerabilities, like Acrobat Reader, Office, Internet Explorer, that kind of thing. For those, you just use the CVSS score and the host value. And finally, the lowest priority are those networking-facing vulnerabilities that the network protects. Start off looking for the worst offenders, have a loose SLA, and then tighten that up later. Oh yes, I love this part. So I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but this is related to prioritization, so bear with me. So what does your network look like? It's what it looks like to me. I'm not a networking architecture kind of guy, but when I see a network, that's what it looks like. You see a lot of green stuff at the top. It's kind of visible, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on underneath the canopy. Lots of ways to get from A to B and to C, and it's a mess down there. So I use a tool. This is a tool I use to map out a network. This isn't vulnerability analysis or vulnerability management. This is a separate tool. And this is an actual real network. Really big one. In fact, this is Cisco. And I can zoom in on that a little bit. And basically this tool has shown me, here are subnets, here are routers, firewalls would be a little brick wall, red brick wall, things like that. And it'll show me, I can click on a subnet and say, I'm going to put my vulnerability scanner here, and I want to scan here, and it'll show me whether it's possible to get there or not. So again, this is the same network. There's a neat little story. So the company I was working for at the time, we were using this tool, and we brought it to Cisco. Not me personally, unfortunately, but this is a great story anyway. They mapped out Cisco's network with this tool and said, well, let's show you what it can do. Where's an important part of your network? And I said, well, let's take this, here's our certificate store down here at the bottom. Let's show that that's secure. So they clicked on it and said, okay, show us all possible ways into this subnet. There should only be 8. All right? And that's what happened. And they said, no, okay, this tool's broken. This is wrong. It can't be right. We know this is secure. And so they took, 2 of their top network experts at Cisco, which is saying a lot, CCIE number 2 and 3 kind of people, and set them on this task of figuring out why this appears to be open. And the tool pointed out it's in this file right here. And then it even said, in this section, this is where the problem's at. And so there's supposed to be, oh, sorry, not 8, 10. 10 servers that should be able to access this subnet. And these two guys are sitting there looking at this file and saying, no, it's all right. It's exactly what it's supposed to be. Are there any Cisco guys in here? Anybody know Cisco? Do you see the problem? The second one? Where? You don't see it? No, not quite? Okay. No, it's not the deny. There's no deny. Yeah, in this case, the deny all wouldn't apply. So it's specifically allowing only these. There's a typo. Yes, who saw it? Excellent. Right there. So, now I'm not a network guy, but from what I've been told is that this ACL, this access list has been defined up there, but it has not been defined with this one. And in Cisco iOS, at least in this particular version, if you use an undefined access list, it's the same as saying allow any. So they sat at this for hours, really smart guys looking at this big long file saying, I don't see a problem. And this tool just with a couple of clicks was saying, yes, here it is, there's a problem. So this is the tool I use. It's called Red Seal. And again, this is still tying back into prioritization for vulnerability management, so this is important. So what I've done here in this example is done an attack simulation. We have, does it show the mouse up here? No, it doesn't. And I don't have like a laser or anything. Okay. Does this have a laser pointer on it? No, it doesn't. Okay. So at the very top, that little red cloud up there is access from the internet. And I've done an attack simulation and said, show me all access into my network from the internet. And it just spit out those blue lines and says, these are the ways in. Now, it did this by taking the configuration files from each of the routers and the firewalls and load balancers and created this virtual model of the network so I can run these queries on it. So the blue lines then showed me the ways in. And then I took my vulnerability scan data and applied it to this model. And then told the model, show me, out of all those ways into my network, where are there vulnerabilities that match up with those access vectors? And then it spit out these 5 red lines. So there's 5 machines, or 5 subnets that have vulnerabilities on it that match up with access vectors. Click on one of them and say, here's my vulnerabilities. Now, before I did this attack simulation, I had a list of 10,000 something vulnerabilities. And then through this method of prioritization, I was able to say, well, out of those 10,000 vulnerabilities, what are the most important ones for me to fix right now? And it happened to be a particular machine that was exposed on port 22 directly to the internet because somebody a few years ago decided that they wanted to work from home. And so they opened up an SSL connection to their box at work so that they could connect into it and work from home. Well, that had an old version of SSL, really old version of SSL, and this particular box is directly exposed to the internet. So now, if someone, and going along with the attack simulation, if someone were to discover that and take over that box, where would they be able to access in the network from there? And it's just a lowly workstation, right? This is how Target happened, essentially. So, metrics. Oh, sorry, there was a little bit more I wanted to say about that. Okay, so beyond optimizing vulnerability prioritization, this helps with understanding your security architecture and contrasting that to your network architecture. You can use it to search for leapfrog vulnerabilities, like that one right there, and calculate downstream risks. So not just how bad is the vulnerability, how important is the device, but if this device were taken over, what would be able to reach from there, and use that as a metric for prioritizing that particular one vulnerability needs to be fixed first. Use it for network device hardening and evaluating network changes. A really good one is network segmentation. So I can say, I've got this one section of the network and this other section of the network. Show me all the ways in between. And not just the open paths, like what happens if this router over here goes down and the network reconfigures itself to go a different way. So those should be taken into consideration as well. And it can also, and here this is the kicker, how can you tell if your vulnerability scanner is able to access everywhere in the network that it should? Well, you asked the network team and they said, okay, put it in this segment and we'll write a, a little exception for it in this one firewall, and it should be able to access everything. Should? Well, yeah, it should. Well, okay, well, what is my network? Give me a list of all the subnets. Oh, well, here's DHCP and here's what's in the DMZ. That should be everything. Should? Is that everything? That's one of the biggest challenges in vulnerability management is, can your scanner reach everything? And what is everything? Because your vulnerability scanner is not going to tell you. It has no idea. It's only going to scan what you tell it to scan. And anything that it's not able to scan, that you tell it to scan, just shows up as empty space. And you're going to be so worried about the vulnerabilities that it does find, you're not going to realize that it's trying to scan this other space and just can't get there. Or there's another space over here that you haven't even told it to scan. Okay, so metrics. Because you got to make the C-suite happy, right? So get off the hamster wheel of pain. Don't measure how busy you are, measure how effective you are. Because in order to improve your metrics over time, if you're measuring how busy you are, what do you have to do to improve? Get more busy, right? So don't measure business, measure effectiveness. Metrics are also used as a justification for the money that's spent on security. Spend some time figuring out what risk means to you. There's lots of ways to do metrics. There's a million different ways to calculate this stuff. Figure out what's important to you, to your organization, standardize on it, make it easy to use, repeatable, and then work with that. There's some pitfalls. DHCP, I already mentioned the effect that DHCP can have on metrics, like trending. If the line is just flat, what does it mean? If it's going up, if it's going down, what does it mean? Have I list of vulnerability or number of vulnerabilities that's going up? Well, it's because I'm not doing my job or because we started scanning a new section of the network. Or it's going down. Am I doing my job or a firewall has been put up in place and I can no longer access that area? So what does the trending mean? Have I added new hosts? Have I taken away hosts? That can mess up metrics as well, causing stale scan data. I mentioned purging the scan data, the database periodically. Take a look what hasn't been seen in the last 2 to 3 months and purge that out. Don't do a wall of shame. Turn it around. Make it a positive thing. Make it security heroes. Maybe even have an MBO or something similar to encourage participation. Make it positive, not negative. Use the carrot, not the stick. Here's some simple metrics. This is the easy stuff. Your vulnerability scanner is going to give you this stuff automatically. Average host risk score, that's an easy one. Percentage of systems with no vulnerabilities, really easy. Percent of hosts scanned within policy. What is policy? A certain number of vulnerabilities, a certain percentage. Percentage of hosts scanned within the last 30 days. If you know where all of your hosts are and how many have been hit or should be scanned. All really easy stuff to calculate. Here's a little bit better example, taking it one step further. We have different subsidiaries, different groups or areas, APAC, Argentina, EMEA, and categorized by how bad is the vulnerability. Sev 5 is the worst. Sev 1 is almost not even worth looking at. And then the number of hosts. And then comparing that to, for the trending effects, I've got more vulnerabilities, but I've also got more hosts. I've got less vulnerabilities, but I also have less hosts. Or maybe I don't have less hosts, maybe a firewall. That's an awful lot of difference in 1 month. Maybe a firewall went up. Maybe the scanner broke and the schedule is no longer happening. Here's a much better example, taking that exact same information and just abstracting it one layer higher. And saying, you've got this set of hosts, the status is red because of this. So taking that to the CIO or the CFO and being able to explain in their language what's going on with the vulnerabilities. Here's some more great examples. This can only be done with something like the tool that I was using before, that was showing the network. Here we have the total number of hosts that are exposed to a vulnerability source, 163. 148 of those can be leapfrogged to attack deeper in the network and access those 458. Of which 394 could be then used to leapfrog further in, but then the network completely protects 636. So you can use that as a further metric for prioritization. What do we have here? The top 10 high-risk vulnerabilities based off of attack. You guys can't read that. Sorry, it's a little bit too small. So we have a list of the top 10 vulnerabilities and how many hosts are exposed by or affected by those vulnerabilities. So you can prioritize that way. And then we have Internet and Trusted Threat Report. Oh, okay. So we have based off of access from a threat source, what vulnerabilities are exposed and can be leapfrogged to how many other hosts and other vulnerabilities, all automatically calculated. So, interoperability. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Oops. There we go. Okay, so asset management. So vulnerability scan data can include information about installed applications and recent users. And then the CMDB data, so the asset management data, can be used to determine the value of the host for prioritization. The vulnerability scan tool will automatically calculate that as well based off of what services are running. So if it sees a database service, it knows it's a higher priority than the services that are typical from a workstation. But if you already have that information in your asset management system, pull that into the vulnerability management system. It can also be used to track down the owner for patching. And speaking of patching, again, patching tools look for the absence of patches, while vulnerability analysis is looking for the presence of vulnerabilities. Integrating the two can eliminate confusion when the patching tool refuses to install a patch that the VA tool insists is necessary. You can also allow the patching team to run ad hoc scans to confirm that their patching efforts are working. Pen testing. So vulnerability scan data, you've already have it. The penetration, you can use that in conjunction with the penetration tool to speed up the pen tests. So the first thing the pen test has to do is do a scan, look for vulnerabilities. Well, if you already have that information, just go ahead and provide it to the pen test, and that'll speed that up. And then the pen test can be used to confirm vulnerabilities that you're maybe not quite certain that the vulnerability scanner is doing its job right. Maybe have a false positive. Your SIMs and IPS. So adding the vulnerability scan data to the SIM or IPS IDLs can help fine-tune and add context for alerts and mitigate false alerts. Alerts can also be used to bump up the priority for vulnerabilities that are being, at this moment being exploited. So there's an alert, someone is trying to attack this vulnerability, let's bump that up in priority so that we can get that fixed. And on the other side, configuring the IDS and the IPS to ignore the vulnerability scan data or the vulnerability scans can remove a lot of false alerts. So if you know you're going to be scanning this section of the network from this IP address, you don't need the IDS lighting up like a Christmas tree saying there's an attack going on when it's just you, right? That's of course just common sense. Ticketing. So do you want one ticket per vulnerability, or do you want a machine or a given service, all of its vulnerabilities to go on one ticket? And then you can also consider adding a process to rescan for vulnerabilities that have been marked as fixed. And then automatically close tickets when the vulnerability is no longer detected. You can also add escalation if the ticket's still open after a certain amount of time. Vector analysis, that's what I was talking about with the map of the network. It's effectively a continuous white box penetration test where it knows about the entire network. You're providing it the information from vulnerabilities. It can all just give you a list of all the possible ways into the network where vulnerabilities can be exploited. Reports from the vector analysis then can be sent to the patching team and the ticketing system to get those vulnerabilities prioritized. It can identify unscanned subnets and can provide risk calculations to GRC. The asset information and the scan results can be fed into GRC, and the vector analysis reports can also be used to fine-tune the risk metrics and for the vulnerability prioritization. So that's it. That was a lot of information, I know. Thanks for attending. I'd like to open up the floor now for the questions you guys have been saving up. Yes, sir. Right. So that was the little bit that I mentioned where the firewall will, even if it whitelists the scanner, it will still correct malformed packets or block them, even if it's whitelisted. So that's just the firewall doing its job, and that's where you can turn it into, set it in what's the word, wire mode, where it just completely passes the packets through without modification, which is not the same thing as the whitelisting. Now, not all firewalls will allow you to do that. So that's where it's much better. It's not always an option. You can't always pick up a scanner and move it to another side of the firewall. One of my customers had worldwide organization, 300-something firewalls. And each section of the network, each country and section within the network had its own firewall in front of it. There's no way they were going to buy 300 vulnerability scanner appliances and put them away, put them all over the place. Something that particular customer did was they used an existing VPN management network and put the scanner appliance at the hub of the VPN and followed those tunnels to basically completely bypass the firewalls. Yes, sir.
When you were talking about risk scores,
yes.
did you have a particular product in mind, or were you speaking more generally? And if it's a particular product, can you comment on how those things are constructed? And if it's more generally, how do people approach the construction of risk scores?
Okay. So how do I calculate risk scores? that's unique to every organization. What is risk for a particular organization? As a general recommendation, where I start is with the CVSS score and the host value, and then the accessibility as a metric. The particular tool that I use, that I'm particularly like to use, and it's my favorite, is QualisGuard. And it has its own risk calculation system, where it says, here's a mail server, the value of the host based off of that service is this. And it will provide that information combined with how bad is the vulnerability. And instead of the CVSS score, it uses a 1 through 5. And it'll say, so this host value times 5 means this. And it can give some metrics. Now, QualisGuard isn't really great on that kind of a risk score, though. And so that's where I try to use that other tool. It's called Red Seal, where that will take then, does a better job, I think, of taking that host value and making it more meaningful in the context of how bad the vulnerability is. So even without adding the network accessibility into it, I can get a better prioritized list. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Do I use endpoint systems, like Tanium or PashLink or something like that? Well, that falls on. Does it? It adds confusion, I think, because the goal of the asset manager, or the endpoint management system, is, well, the management, but also the installing of the patches. And the vulnerability scan is looking at things from the opposite point of view. So certainly you want to correlate the data, because a great example, I had a customer up in St. Louis that came to me and said, this is, the patch management team is fighting against this data that QualisGuard is giving us. Say it's full of false positives. It's nothing but crud in there, to say nicely. And so I flew up there and I sat down with the team, and they were trying to correlate the data. And this is saying the patch is installed, and this is saying it's missing. And the biggest problem I found, and it was they had an old version of Office that had been upgraded to a newer version of Office in place, rather than wiped out and installed. Well, Office, whenever you install a new version on top of an old one, it'll upgrade and update the DLLs that it needs, but the DLLs that it doesn't need, it doesn't delete them. It just leaves them there. So we have DLLs that are from an old version of Office that QualisGuard was looking at and saying, there's a vulnerability, install this patch for Office XP. Well, we can't install the patch for Office XP. It doesn't exist. We've got this newer version of Office, right? So we were able to dig through the data that QualisGuard was providing, and it was saying exactly, this DLL has this version number. Then they could go on the host and confirm, yes, that DLL is there and has that version number. They couldn't patch it, but then they could take that information and make a decision. What do they want to do? Do they want to go and delete those old DLLs, or what's the decision? But having that correlation between the two was really difficult at first, because they didn't understand what they were looking at. And they were just saying, I trust the patch system. I know it's doing its job. I think it's doing its job, but that's my tool. That's what I use every day. I trust it. You're bringing along this other thing that's telling me that my tool is crap, and I know my tool isn't crap. So yours must be. Any other questions? Let's see how much more time we've got. We've got about 4 more minutes. Sir?
So you mentioned the term leapfroggable, which another Red Seal term, and has to do with their own research that they contribute towards some of these vulnerabilities. But what have you seen, or what are the criteria that they'll use to test this leapfroggable? Does it require a remote code exec?
Okay, so what's the criteria for being categorized as a leapfrog? And basically means that you can remotely take over the box and use it as a stepping stone to get further into the network. So I can install some sort of a software on that box, which then lets me into the box and then continue on from there.
Okay, so like a non-administrative, like remote shell.
For example, yes, it doesn't have.
Remote code exec, you would call that leapfroggable.
Yeah, so there's plenty of vulnerabilities that you can't use to leapfrog that you still may be exposed to a threat source and you want to fix. Something that would enable a denial of service attack, for example, but would not allow you to take remote control of it. And you might not even necessarily be able to get full remote control, but just enough control that you can install a file and then have that file start up and start running. And if that's possible at all, then that makes leapfrog possible. And those are then the highest priority of vulnerabilities that you want to fix. Anything else? Any questions? Well, I was really happy that you guys were here listening to my talk. I saw a few, there's a few faces that I recognize and know, and you guys know me and still came to watch the talk, so that was encouraging. I'm glad you guys were here. Thank you for listening in, and you guys have a great day.